Now, you have an enormous impact with young men, and I speak to mothers of young men, and so many of them, whatever their political persuasion, are really concerned about the crisis amongst boys, the anti-male sentiment that we hear so much about in popular culture, toxic masculinity, male privilege, all these sort of negative messages. How do we counter that? What would be your message to mothers of young boys?
Part of what you do is you counter that in the home first, to the degree that a mother might be motivated by a resentful quasi-feminist ethos. That's going to manifest itself in her son's life. It's like, well, I'm antagonistic to the patriarchy. Okay, so what do you mean by that? The patriarchy, is that a manifestation of the central spirit of masculinity? Or what is it? Because if it's not that, then what is it? Well, let's say it's that. Well, your son's masculine, so how do you think your attitude towards masculinity is going to work for him? You're going to treat him like he's a baby patriarchal oppressor? Or that his ambition is part of the force that rapes and pillages the planet? And that's that idea sort of lurking at the basis of all your interactions with him? You think that's going to go well? That's the devouring mother from the Freudian perspective. That's not going to go well. And so it's good to remember, if you're a mother, when you talk about the patriarchy, you're talking about your son.
But even in boys' schools, even in education centres that are supposed to be devoted to good outcomes for boys, there is just so much unrelenting messaging about toxic masculinity and male privilege. I just wonder, what impact does that have on young men growing up?
We know what impact it has on them. They just drop out. Why wouldn't they? So imagine they're actually ethical, their boys are ethical in their fundamental orientation. So then they hear that their desire to engage in rough and tumble play, their desire to point and shoot at things, for example, which is deeply masculine, deeply human for that matter, because we point and shoot and aim at things. That's our entire physiological platform. We're hunting creatures. And so your ambition is nothing but a manifestation of the corrupt and oppressive patriarchy. And as I said, you're part of the force that destroys the planet. If you have a shred of ethical sense and you're a young man, that's just going to stop you. It's going to just demotivate you. And in some sense, that's the purpose, because women who are afraid of men confuse competence with power. And then they believe that the road to peace is the antagonism to power. And because they don't discriminate between power and competence, they become antagonistic to their son's competence. And then they reap exactly what they sow. They end up with incompetent boys. Well, what went wrong? It's like, well, how about you discouraged every sign of competence, every chance you had? I read this account a while back. A woman author in the United States, whose name I don't remember, talked about just how difficult it was to stop her son from playing with guns. She said, well, I took every gun out of the house, or even anything that remotely looked like a gun, and that boy, he'd take the toothbrush and shoot the cat with it. And how appalling is that? It's like, oh, you're quite the monster, aren't you? You saw something manifest in your son that was so deep, this desire to point and shoot, let's say, that despite your best efforts, you couldn't crush it. And then you didn't even notice that you were spending all that time trying to crush it, and it was so deep that you couldn't, and you still regarded what you were doing as a virtue. It's like, boy, your son, he certainly needs a new mother. That's for sure. So
I worry though also about girls, because academically they're doing much better from preschool all the way to university.
A little rough on the mental health front.
Exactly, on the mental health front. And I wonder, being told you're a victim, that you're oppressed, even though if you live in the West, what does that do to the female psyche of a young woman growing up?
It definitely increases the degree to which young women are anxious and depressed, because it makes them self-conscious. And we know the more you think about yourself, the more unhappy you are. And it's such a striking phenomenon that if you look at this statistically, there's almost no difference between self-conscious thoughts, so thoughts that involve I, let's say, and suffering from the ravages of negative emotion, like emotion and depression. And so this obsessive self-centeredness, narrow self-centeredness, just makes all of that suffering much, much worse. So that's clearly the case. And A victim is someone to whom things constantly happen involuntarily. And if you construe yourself as a victim rather than as an actor, let's say, then as an actor of your own destiny, then you put yourself in a situation where you're constantly under what your body responds to as stress. So that's clearly no good. And then I think there's another factor that's, many other factors that are confusing young women. Confusion on the sexual front, the idea that if you're properly liberated, then the entire gamut of sexual freedom opens itself up to you, and that's how life should work. It's just, that's just not true at all. It's especially not true for women. I mean, I've been toying with the idea, and I think this might be right, that it's the capacity to say no that gives young women status. That's actually the base. So imagine that young women are competing for young men of status. So then the question is, and maybe they're at a disadvantage because they want higher status males, right? So that puts them at a perennial disadvantage, and there's some truth in that. So then what do the women have as a buttress against that status differential? And I would say all they have is the ability to say no, because when you say no as a young woman to a desirable young man, you're saying, I have something to offer you that won't just be given away, despite the fact that you're of high status. And so you blow that apart in the name of sexual freedom. I think you deprive young women of you deprive them of all their status. It's not like the young men don't know that. They know that perfectly well. They respect young women who say no. They might complain and cavil and carp about it, but when push comes to shove, and the data on this are quite clear.
Well, it seems a lot of the women's liberation movement of late, the sexual liberation and that you spoke about, it seems to advantage men far more than women.
Well, no, it doesn't.
Well, because they get the sex without the responsibility.
Yeah, but it doesn't disadvantage men. It disadvantages a very small proportion of hyper-successful and increasingly predatory men. Because it disadvantages most men, because what happens is that when the sexual constraints are lifted off women, they all migrate to a very small percentage of men. 5% maybe. And then those men have an almost unlimited field of sexual access. And so you could say that's a benefit to them, but it's not, because it trains them to be manipulative, Machiavellian, instrumental psychopaths, because all they're doing is pursuing a string of pleasure-based, hedonistic, short-term relationships. That's bad training if you want to be a reciprocal human being and if you want to learn how to participate in a real relationship. So, and then it's catastrophe for the women, because none of those men are incentivized to form anything that approximates a long-term relationship. And then the rest of the men are left with nothing. Yeah, so that's
disastrous for society.
Disastrous, yeah, it's disastrous.